Good evening, and welcome to Copperfield's Books virtual event with Matt Siegel. My name is Jamie Madsen, and I'm the Marketing and Events Coordinator here at Copperfield's Books, and I'll also be your host for the evening. So I'd like to take a quick moment here and thank you all for your continued support of our events program. We could not have this program without you, so thank you. And just a couple of items before we get started. Go ahead and keep an eye on your chat box. I will be using this tonight to provide links to view tonight's title, discount codes, information about the author, and the like. And additionally, the format will feature between 35 to 45 minutes of speaking and will then be followed by a live Q&A. If you look at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you'll see an icon that says Q&A. Please go ahead and submit your questions and comments here rather than replying to my post in the chat box. So now I'm thrilled to introduce tonight's author, Matt Seigel. Matt has written about food and culture for publications including The Atlantic, Fast Company, and the Paris Review. A former English professor, he now lives in Richmond, Virginia with his dog, Waffles. And he is with us this evening to discuss his fascinating debut, The Secret Food of History. Strange but true stories about the origins of everything we eat.
I'm good. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. So how about we dive right in? Okay,
Let's do it.
Right. So great place to start. There are so many books today who are written by nutrition experts or celebrity chefs. Start us off with what made you decide to write about food from a historical perspective?
Yeah, so, it wasn't deliberate or intentional. I was an English professor, as I think you mentioned. So naturally, I love research and narrative and symbolism and looking way too closely at subjects. But I also love food. So really just as a hobby, for years, I would just spend my nights and weekends researching food and going down all these weird rabbit holes about food topics. And what I realized two things. The first is that the history of food is really consistently stranger than fiction. A lot of it just really, really sounds made up. And the other thing I realized was that just no one, despite all of the great food blogs and books and podcasts, we've got so much food media today, but no one seemed to be focusing on the topics that I was focusing on. So, I basically wrote the book that I wanted to read.
Well, that's super fascinating. You write a lot about how humans are hardwired to obsess over food. And considering today's abundance of not just books about food, but blogs, podcasts, Instagram posts, do you think we've reached the peak of obsession? And do you think we are more obsessed about food than ever before?
I don't think so. So, a lot of people tell me, hey, it's such a good time to write a book about food. People have never been more obsessed about food. And, I hope it's a good time to write a book about food. Certainly we have more food media than we ever have in history. But we also have more technology and more people, right? But I think humans have always been equally obsessed about food. If you go back to the very first cave paintings, they were mostly of food, right? And, I spent the past couple of years, reading old manuscripts and, personal travel logs and diaries. And I can't tell you how often someone from the 1700s wrote down everything they ate in a lot of detail. So, I think if the ancient Egyptians had Instagram, that they would have been taking pictures of food just as much as we are. We just happen to have more people and more technology. But, we really haven't changed much. And that's one of the themes of the book.
That's so interesting. And kind of along those lines, I found it really fascinating how you read a lot about historical food myths, the idea that vanilla is vanilla and potatoes cause leprosy and syphilis. What's the biggest food myth that still remains today?
Yeah, so, fortunately, we figured out that, a lot of those things aren't true. Potatoes don't cause syphilis. But, I think the biggest myth that remains is that we think we know about food. We think that, it's it's, you know, the future, right? We're living in a crazy world where we have so much information and we just assume that we've figured out food and our bodies, and we really haven't. I mean, you know, our top scientists still can't figure out or still can't agree on whether or not eggs are good for us. And, you know, I think we still have a lot to learn about our bodies and food. We're still discovering new things about taste and the function of taste and the mind-gut connection. So yeah, I think, you know, there's still a lot to learn. And, you know, I think our children or their children are going to look back at us in the same way that we look back at people and laugh at the fact that they thought tomatoes were poisonous and that potatoes caused leprosy.
It's a fascinating thought. Well, you also reveal that a lot of surprising things about food. Tell us one or two facts or topics that you think will surprise our readers the most.
Yeah, you know, there's a lot, but I think on the whole, probably the history of cereal. Now, this is a topic that might not be new to hardcore foodies, but I think I shine a lot of new light on it. But for those who aren't familiar at all, you know, cereal is super ubiquitous today, and it's known for, you know, most cereal is super sugary, and it's got all these bright colors. It's got cartoon mascots and free prizes and, you know, puzzles on the back of the box. It's this super fun, enjoyable thing. But it was actually created to be intentionally bland and as bland and boring as possible. So cold breakfast cereal, what we know today, it was created in the 1800s by religious health reformists, including Dr. Harvey Kellogg and a lot of other people that names we might recognize, who, you know, they really saw sugar and pleasure as just sins, and they were really worried about temptation of the body. So they deliberately set out to create a food that would keep you as, you know, as mellow as possible and keep you from getting mentally or physically excited so that, you know, you could focus on not giving in to sins and alleged sins and temptations.
That's fascinating. Do you think there's any cereal still out there today that might resemble cereal from history?
You know, so a lot of the same brands, most of the big cereal manufacturers today, if you trace back their roots, they started out during that era. So Post was another guy, you know, General Mills, the name Mills, it refers to an old flour mill. But, you know, most of the companies, I think, have since learned that it's a better business model to add sugar and free prizes. I think they still market the idea of health, and sort of the new thing is fuel, right? You know,
Right.
like we're all these like athletic cereals. But, you know, I think adding a lot of sugar is still par for the course. And, you know, the very first cereals, the reason we soaked them in milk is they might have broken your teeth if you didn't. So the very first ones you would soak overnight in milk to soften them up. So, you know, something like Grape Nuts, maybe you could, you know, it's probably the closest you can get commercially today, just general gravel.
It's really interesting. This one is a really fascinating thing. I'm so interested. You claim that originally pie crusts were not meant to be eaten, but what do you do with a pie crust if not eat it?
Yeah, so the first pie crusts, they were called coffins, and sort of an appropriate name. And they were an early version of aluminum foil. So, you know, this is before we had things like aluminum foil and all these, you know, convenient forms of cookware. And the real sole purpose of early pie crust was just to keep the ingredients in so you could bake them and then maybe store them afterwards. But they were much thicker and much harder than today's crusts. And yeah, they were traditionally thrown away after eating. That really started to change in the early American colonies when wheat was scarce and colonists didn't have the luxury to throw out anything. So really the scarcity of wheat forced the colonists to literally stretch their crusts until it became flaky and thin. And now, of course, it's certainly one of the most important parts of pie. There aren't too many parts, but a lot of people's favorite part.
Yeah, one of the best parts, right? In my opinion. Okay, well, another interesting part of the book was, well, let me ask you, did ice cream really help defeat the Nazis?
I think the key word is help. So, one thing I touch on in the book in a bunch of different chapters is war. And, food and war go way, way, way back. Food has been used as a weapon, for thousands of years, and it still is. Early on, you're talking about throwing beehives at your enemies, or dropping hot cooking oil off of castles during sieges, or poisoning food. But for most of history, the biggest role of food in war was feeding your soldiers, right? It's a huge effort to feed all those people on the move, sometimes overseas, away from home. So the primary focus of food throughout history when it came to war was calories and just sustenance, right? The idea that if your soldiers couldn't eat, they couldn't march. But the United States started to change that during World War II, when they really said, look, we're not just going to worry about providing calories for our troops. We want them to have some comforts of home. We want to remind them what they're fighting for. And they really went to massive, massive lengths to ensure that soldiers at home and overseas had as much access to ice cream as possible. Air, sea, and land. They had ice cream barges trolling the Pacific, delivering ice cream to smaller ships. They had pop-up ice cream, factories, literally delivering ice cream to foxholes. So yeah, and if you think about it, this is the 1940s. Refrigeration, we didn't have the technology we have today, and even today it's a huge issue. But no, they went through massive, massive lengths to deliver ice cream to our troops. And, that's part of what made ice cream so ubiquitous, right? They came back from war, and new technologies came out, and, the post-war boom, ice cream really took off partially for that reason.
Wow. Well, I'm really kind of excited to dive into the title. So your title of the book is The Secret History of Food, but the book is filled with hundreds of notes and references from other fields like art, medicine, psychology, archaeology, religion. How did you come up, or did you struggle with calling this the history of food?
Yeah, it's tough. It's tough to put a title on things. I think calling it The Secret History, right, gives gives readers some idea that it's not a typical history book. But, personally, look, there's a lot of history in here, but it's certainly not your typical history book. I look at it really as a book of essays. I think the title works. People seem to love the title, but it's about a lot more than just history. And, it's about a lot more than about food. It's about humans, right? It's about our relationship with food. So there's a lot in there about, psychology and evolution and biology and archaeology. We get into, things like art, religion, so it's I don't want to say it's all over the place, but we cover a lot of fields beyond just history. And I think for those looking for a comprehensive history book, I don't want to say I don't think they'll be disappointed. I think there's a lot of things about food and history that are pretty well known, and there's a lot of great books about that. I chose 10 chapters, each with a different food or theme that I thought people would be interested in, that really have been, things that have been lost or forgotten to history.
Well, that's what makes it so rich, right? It covers a
I hope
lot of,
so.
yeah. Along those lines, regarding food, what was the most challenging subject to research?
Yeah, so there were a lot of, all of it was pretty challenging to research. I took about at least 100 pages of notes for every chapter I wrote. Before I
Wow.
started writing the chapter, I took over 100 pages of notes. So there's a lot of tough research there. One of the most surprising topics was just a small tangent on honey. So we have a chapter on honey, and I just thought while writing it, it wasn't in the plans, but I just thought, there's no way I can write a whole chapter about honey without tackling or mentioning the adage that you catch more flies with honey than vinegar.
Yes.
So I just thought, while I was writing it, hey, maybe I should include just a little footnote or a little parenthetical about, hey, by the way, scientifically that's not true, or scientifically it is true. And I thought that would take me 20 minutes to research. I really thought that, hey, this is an easy thing I can Google and move on. But it took me almost a month to, of course I overdo things, but it took me almost a month to research that. I couldn't find anyone who had actually taken that adage literally or seriously. So I talked to a number of fly experts. I tracked down, a lot of different studies. I tracked down a diary of a farmer who did these tests on a bunch of different substances like beer and banana, decayed banana, fresh banana, hundreds of years ago. So I went down a pretty long, couple weeks rabbit hole to answer that question. And the answer, which I give in the book, is it really depends. And it depends on an insane, whether or not you'll catch more flies with honey or vinegar. It depends on everything from the gender of the fly, the sex drive, their mating status, their thirst and hunger level, the season, the time of the day, how old they are. There are a lot of different variables that I hadn't planned on researching so much about flies when I set out to write the book.
Right. Well, how often did you get hungry writing this?
All the time. Yeah. It was hard writing and more it was during the research, right? So just reading about all these recipes, some of them weren't very appetizing, but a lot of them were. My cravings tended to follow the chapters. So I wrote the chapters in order. So I ate a lot of cereal during the cereal chapter. I ate a lot of ice cream during the ice cream chapter. Hot peppers, not so much, but I got hungry all the time. I had to bring snacks with me for sure.
That
Researching.
Such a funny picture. I just picture you writing over your manuscript with ice cream. Like, it's perfect.
Yeah, I did a lot of research in the Library of Congress, and you're not allowed to bring in a whole lot of stuff there for security reasons. So yeah, I would have to take snack breaks pretty often.
That's awesome. Well, did you come across a lot of imagery in your research, and did you consider including that in the book?
Yeah. I kept a huge log of images I came across, just all sort of things from old, the original patents for the cereals, which, some of them are kind of interesting when they came out with the patents for like marshmallows, for example, like the smiley marshmallows and Lucky Charms. It's just sort of funny seeing the patent drawings for those. But yeah, tons of imagery. There's a lot of, I referenced some art. Certainly, I talked about war, a lot of images relating to war and in ice cream, and old stuff from manuscripts, illuminated manuscripts. So I collected everything. I think logistically, when you go to decide whether or not to put that in the book, that's more of an editor's decision. And, we ended up not putting it in this version, maybe in a future version. But yeah, there's a lot of fun stuff out there for sure. And I do my best to describe what I wasn't able to put in.
That's great. Well, I bet are there any stories or topics that didn't make the final cut?
Yeah, so I mentioned, I took over 100 pages of notes for each chapter. There's a lot that didn't make it into the book. I wanted the chapters to be thematic, right? I don't really go in chronological order, which is tough. I go by topic, talking about food and humans. So there's some interesting things that I had to cut just because I make a lot of tangents. I just told you I went on a tangent about flies. But there's such a thing as too many tangents. There's some stories that are important, but they've been told more often, or just stories that, make it difficult to stick to the topic, right? It's already sort of a manic book. We're covering enough there. So yeah, you have to sort of murder some darlings, but, hopefully, another project. I haven't forgotten that stuff.
Right, part 2. Well, I did kind of want to cut into the cover, and did you have one there you could share with us? Maybe you could tell us a little bit about how you came to the final cover.
Yeah, so that looks super white.
No, we can see it great.
Okay.
Yeah.
The cover was interesting. That was something I was really looking forward to. It was a long process, over 2 years from the day I sold the book to the day it came out. But that was one of the things I was really looking forward to was, writing can be a lonely process. So, the idea of like actually collaborating with people and, seeing the different covers was really exciting. I love the cover. I think a lot of people love the cover. But it was challenging. We ended up going with foods from the book. So you'll see, a lot of the foods I just talked about there. But again, we talked about all the other fields and topics you talk about, right? So how do you convey to people that this isn't a textbook? This isn't, a dry textbook about history. It's got some different things in there. But yes, same thing with the title, right? The Secret History of Food.
Yeah.
It took a lot of, I think the artists honestly had the hardest job, between everyone who worked on this book. There were a lot of people, but man, the artists went through more revisions than I did, revising different covers and coming up with all, I really just had an editor to answer to, whereas they had me, they had editors, they had marketing people, publicity people, buyers. So, hats off certainly to them. I'm super, super grateful.
Yeah, it turned out great. Well, I do want to switch gears here and talk a little bit about your writing process. And I know you have a really fascinating story about how you even began writing this book. So maybe you can tell us a little about that. And you did talk about how long it took to write, but give us a little brief history of how you got into it.
Yeah, well, in terms of how I got into it, I mentioned that really I didn't deliberately set out to write it. I just, I was doing this research as a hobby, as a passion. And then I started to, put together the idea for a book. I sort of tested the waters a few years ago. I wrote an article on ice cream and war for The Atlantic, just, to sort of prove an audience for this, and it was pretty, great working with them, and they loved the article. They wanted me to write more topics on food. I decided instead to write a book. And so, it was a number of years really just looking back at everything I researched. I mentioned I didn't really have an agenda. I didn't set out to write about ice cream and cereal and honey and hot peppers. I just went down weird rabbit holes and just kept researching food topics that were not related and human topics that weren't seemingly not related. And after a couple of years of that, I looked back at what I had and I tried to make connections and say, what do these things have in common? What's the angle here? I put together a book proposal that took a long time, nights and weekends, to work on getting the book proposal right. But once we took it to market, I still pinch myself. We sold the proposal day one in a preempt to obviously Echo, who's, I've always looked up to Echo. They put out Bourdain's books and a lot of other books by people I really look up to. So yeah, I sold it, immediately quit my job and got a dog. And, then I really just got down to writing, and it took me about a little over a year to write the book. My process,
It's pretty fast.
I don't know. It didn't feel fast. It was about a chapter every 6 weeks or so. Mm-hmm. And there's I guess a lot, and maybe the audience will have more questions about this later, but I tended to write in sprints. So like, maybe some people can write 8 hours straight, 6 hours straight. I can't imagine that. I'm good for an hour and a half, 2 hours maybe, and then I'll take a break and come back for another. If I'm lucky, I'll get 2, maybe 3 sessions in a day. A lot of times it's just one. But I actually wrote probably a third of the book by the pool. I would write, for an hour or so, get too hot, hop in the pool for a while, get out. And, it was just a really relaxed, inspiring place to write. You don't have like the distractions, right? And then I wrote the second half of the book. I finished it up during COVID. So that was a whole nother story. It was more challenging to get some research materials. So I'm super grateful to a lot of libraries and librarians who helped me out there.
Right.
But yeah, it was a fun process. I found myself laughing just so often, just reading some of the things that I ended up, putting in the book myself.
That's so great. I mean, I can't believe 2 years ago, you were a professor, and then now here we are. It's such an interesting story. And to ask you a little bit more about, the process, did you struggle to break into traditional publishing as a first-time author? I know you had some people reading things beforehand, but were you worried about the social media following or your platform in any way?
Yeah, I was super... I don't know if I was worried. I guess I was worried. I want to sound tough and say I wasn't, but yeah, no, I was worried. It was certainly on my mind. When I went to sell the book, I didn't have any social media at all.
Wow.
Now I'm on Instagram, and I don't have a huge platform on Instagram. And yeah, I was worried that's what people look for. Traditional publishing has certainly changed a lot. That's one of the reasons I, again, wrote that article for The Atlantic, and I'd written some other publications. And, between my teaching, I had some credentials. But, I think there's certainly, good reason to look for people who have big followings and can help sell the book. But yeah, as I mentioned, I thought I would have to sort of explain that to potential buyers. I imagined that I would have to say, look, I'll get on social media. We've got, 2 years. I'll do all the work. I'm sorry, I don't have a following. But no, my publisher was great. As I told you, they told me the first day that it was a book they had to have, and they were really excited about the book. And the more I grilled them about like, hey, how important is social media? they just kept telling me, look, write a good book. And, I tried my best to do that.
And you did. So what's your social media like now?
I don't know. It's mostly pictures of my dog.
Great. So we do typically have a lot of aspiring authors as attendees. What would be your advice for anybody who's aspiring to break in?
Yeah, man, there's a lot to cover here. So again, in the audience, if you have specific questions about, advice for writing or getting published or focusing, or if you lose ideas, I'm happy to talk about anything. I think, I think, again, people like me who are worried, hey, can I break into traditional publishing? I think, at the end of the day, write the best book you can. And I think that's more important than anything. In terms of general advice to aspiring authors, I think a lot of people are told, write what you know. And that always killed me. I think, from my perspective, I don't think you should write what you know. I think you should write what you don't know. I think if we look at, again, I'm speaking more from nonfiction here, right? But if you look at any of the great essays or books out there, they're explorations, right? You're exploring something on paper, and that's where a real story comes from, when you have a beginning, a middle, and an end, and things are at stake. So yeah, I think write what you don't know, write what you want to know, and go out and find that story and ask yourself questions and doubt yourself and uncover new things. And I think that's where the best writing comes from. Another tip is time. I mean, for me, time is just the best thing for writing. I can't tell you how often I have an idea, or I actually go with an idea and I write something and I think it's brilliant, and I'm all caffeinated, which is another tip. I'm all caffeinated and I'm in love with what I've written, and then I sleep on it and I look at it the next day and it's just terrible. So I sleep on things as often as possible. I'm not a quick writer in terms of that. I think the more you can sleep on things, take a break, not look at it for a night, not look at it for a week, and revisit it, I think that's how you can bring clarity to your work.
I'm muted. Sorry, I was talking. Thanks for that. So you told me a little bit about this, but I was hoping you'd share the story of what you did right after you sold your book.
Yeah, I got the call, just after 9 a.m. in the morning when I was at work. I wasn't teaching at the time. I was doing some work for a marketing agency, and that was a super exciting day. I spent most of the day on the phone with people around the office, wondering, what was going on. But yeah, as soon as we cemented that deal over the phone, I gave my notice there, and then I knew I was going to be. This was before COVID, and I knew I was going to be working from home. So I went out and I got a dog to. I'd wanted a dog for a long time, but I felt bad, leaving him at home when I was at work. So those are two of the first things I did. I called my mom, and a few friends. So
what kind of dog?
A mini golden doodle. He's around here somewhere.
Well, that's really awesome. I want to thank you again. We covered a lot. And before I ask you, what's next, let's go ahead and open it up to the questions and comments. Again, if you haven't submitted yours, just go ahead under the Q&A icon. And right now, it's great that the only question we have is, do you have autographed books? So no, we do not, but I might be able to work it out if Matt's willing to send some signed book plates to Copperfields.
Super. Yeah, I have book plates. So super willing to do that. And you can you can work out the the details of that through you.
Absolutely.
But yeah, we will definitely get you signed copies.
So yes, Susan, they will be available. I'll include that in the email tomorrow. And I'm receiving so many thank yous for having this event. I know food topics are really popular with our audience. So before I let you go, what's next for you?
I'm going to keep doing this as long as I can. So,
Right.
I mentioned I've got a lot more material. So I'm working on a few book proposals now. I'm going to gonna relax and rest up a little bit and catch up on my reading. For the past 2 years, I've been reading just a lot of reference material. So I can probably pick up some new books. Maybe I'll go to your site, see if I can find a few.
Yeah. Yeah, well, we look forward to that. And hopefully next time we can have you in person. I know you're not on the West Coast, but maybe we can work it out where you are.
Yeah, I would love to. In the meantime, here's the
Yes.
book. I will either send you some signed copies of this that your customers can pick up, or signed book plates.
Well, that would be great. I will definitely follow up with you tomorrow about that. And yes, to everyone asking, this is being recorded. Tomorrow you will receive an email with a link to the recording. It will include the link to purchase tonight's title and the discount code. And basically, if all you did was watch tonight, that's okay. We've got you covered. So on that note, I really want to thank you again, Matt, and hope to have you back in the near future.
Yeah,
Rest up.
my pleasure. It's bedtime here on the East Coast, so I'm gonna head to bed. But yeah, my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
Great. Good night, everyone.
Good night.